and my website eventually as well. So thanks for joining this session. So this is about making sense of employee survey data, so we'll be touching on that. And I thought I would just do a quick intro about me, but before I do, just to say this is part of a series of sessions that I'm going to be running now, which is about building organisational capability, mainly through the lens of change. But in fact, as we'll find from this presentation, that when you're building change capability, actually it relates to employee engagement and other attributes of high-performing organisations as well. So who am I? I am a member of the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, where I take a lot of my evidence from, and it's worth joining them up. There are lots of free resources, and you can take exams and things to become sort of qualified in evidence-based management. And I'm also a fellow CIPD member, and both of those, actually, most of what I'm going to be talking about today is drawn from this evidence review by CIPD on employee engagement, which was written by the Centre for Evidence-Based Management for CIPD. And this is the way that CIPD are going for an evidence-based approach, because as we'll sort of discuss here, it makes a lot of sense, and our profession and practice really needs it. But saying all of that, I mean, I'm not going to go into who I am in detail. I mean, I do have 20 to 25 years experience in organisational development and change, but this is about the evidence. And on a light-hearted note, I wouldn't believe anything that I say. I would always refer to the evidence. So see me as more of a conduit to those sources of evidence, and I can send you links for studies and things, but I've referenced a lot of what I've been referring to here, and obviously that CIPD report has a lot of references in it as well. So what are we going to cover today? So I was going to talk through where we are with employee engagement, just use some examples of popular measures of employee engagement and potentially some challenges with those. Why is employee engagement important? So what's the sort of background and history? And then what's the evidence that supports the existence of employee engagement? Does a thing actually exist or not? And how do we bring all of that together to find a way forward on employee engagement? So I'm just admitting Sean back in again. I'm having to re-admit everybody. Great. Okay, good. So where are we with employee engagement? Before we get into that, I just wanted to talk about what we mean by constructs within psychology or organisational development. I think it's worth understanding what we mean by a construct. So a construct is just something in our head that we can all refer to, that we know kind of exists and what it is. So it could be a chair, a cupboard, a human, whatever it is. When we mention that word, we know, oh yeah, I know what that is, and that's so important for our brains because we form mental models of what things are, and so we can make sort of assumptions based on that. And I just put up this image because this is a nice sort of teaser around that, really, saying that this is not a pipe. And obviously it's not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. A pipe, we can handle, we can smoke in it, we can fill it up with tobacco, we can tap it on our teeth or whatever we want to do. And if we don't define things properly, if we don't know what we mean by things, then there's a whole host of problems that come with that. How do we talk about it? How do we know we're talking about the same thing? How do we measure it? How do we predict from that something is going to happen? If I light a pipe and put tobacco in it, smoke's going to come out. So then that comes down to, well, what is the utility of something? What's the point in having it if we don't really know what it is? And if we don't know what it is, we can't operationalize it. And so it becomes kind of a useless construct for organizations because we can't do anything with it. And this is why I've sort of entitled this The Treachery of Employee Engagement, because this is the challenge that we have with employee engagement. So just a bit more detail about what we mean by a valid construct. So it's got to be coherent. So we've got to be able to, it's got to have a clear definition. Sorry, starting from the top. It's got to have a clear definitions. We've got to know what we're talking about. So employee engagement has 50 different definitions, which, is kind of comical in a way, because if we sat down and tried to invent 50 definitions of employee engagement, we probably couldn't find them. But 50 definitions of employee engagement have arisen. So that kind of sets alarm bells off to start off with. And so because there's so many definitions, there are the scope of employee engagement is huge. So it's referred to as sort of happiness. It's about motivation, it's about energy, it's about effort, it's about commitment, shared purpose, etc. So it really is, it could be anything. And if we are going to define it and we're going to use it as a valid construct, then we've got to know on what knowledge it's built on. We can't just pluck things out of the air and sort of say, right, we're coming up with this completely new construct without referring it to other things that we know exist within psychology. So everything is emergent from something else. No idea is an island. So when we're looking at employee engagement, we have to ask ourselves, okay, so what other constructs does this kind of relate to, so that we can sort of build out our body of knowledge and understand the interrelationship and really narrow down where this particular construct is different from others. And if we get all these things right, if we have clear definitions, scope, and we understand the relationships with other constructs, then we have a coherent idea. And we go back to the pipe analogy, we can define what it is. We all know what it means. We understand its sort of scope of use and where it fits in, how it's different from tobacco or how it's different from a cigarette or whatever it is. And we understand what its relationship is with other things, who kind of smokes pipes, if anybody smokes pipes anymore. And so we have a valid construct, we have a valid idea of what something is, and we can talk about it, and we can start making predictions and understand how it works in reality. So the first point is, can we define it? So as I mentioned, there are 50 different definitions that came from Engage for Success. They ran this report several years ago to understand more about what engagement means. So we don't really know what it means because there are so many different definitions, and people define it as a behavior. So they talk about discretionary effort. They talk about attitude, so commitment to the organization or commitment to colleagues. It's a sort of a feeling that we have, a feeling of enthusiasm or vigor or energy or something. Or it's a condition of work. It's, whether we have a desk and a table, and whether we have support from our colleagues. And this is very much, that condition of work was very much where the famous Gallup 12 developed their metrics, which we'll go into in more detail. So first of all, I just want to talk about common measures and whether they really are measuring a valid construct. So ENPS, so we see employee net promoter scores, and we see that as a composite measure, a high-level generic measure of employee engagement that lots of organizations use and lots of people selling employee engagement surveys refer to. And this was a concept that was sort of dreamt up in marketing in 2003 by this guy, Fred Reichheld. And it was a great idea that you have sort of detractors from your brand and promoters of your brand, and you want to harness the promoters of your brand in order to drive sales. But there's no real empirical evidence that actually happens, and that the net promoter score is actually a valid measure of performance of an organization or sales. But because it got published in HBR and several gurus got behind it, marketing gurus got behind it, it sort of took off, and then organizations started to use it in marketing. And for some reason, it then migrated to the idea in employee engagement that you have certain people who are engaged, who will promote your organization, and people who are detractors, who will then not promote you. And so what people say to other people outside the organization then became a measure of employee engagement. And there's clearly all sorts of problems with that, because if it doesn't work in marketing, why would it work in in employee engagement, and people might be promoting your organisation for a whole host of reasons, or not promoting it for a whole host of reasons that may or may not be related to employee engagement. Anyway, I wrote a Mythbuster piece about this, which is on my LinkedIn, which you can read in more detail there. So ENPS is quite a suspect measure. So another measure is Gallup, and the Gallup Q12, which is the famous 12 questions for measuring employee engagement, was actually used to measure workplace conditions. So it's very much a scale used around well-being and measuring positive emotions, and they define engagement as sitting within well-being. So well-being is a bigger construct, and engagement sort of sits within that. And they use Maslow's hierarchy of needs to say, well, there are different levels that you will go through in order to reach the highest level of engagement. And there are problems with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and hence there are problems with those 12 questions and the ordering of that. So, for instance, at the top of the order, a belonging stage, they've got, well, I've had a conversation. A measure of that is I've had a conversation within the last 6 months with someone in my organisation about my growth and development. But then at the bottom of the hierarchy of needs, they've got my expectations are clear. So they're saying, well, we can't start engagement until the expectations are clear. But the only way you can start getting those expectations clear is by having a conversation, hopefully more than or within 6 months if you're starting in an organisation. So we already have a sort of a conflict in terms of what that hierarchy means. And in fact, all those things, those Q12 questions, should all be happening really at the same time if we're going to have engagement. And there are other levels, there are other issues as well. That there is an assumption that engaged employees equals productive workers, or increases in employee performance, and this is called predictive validity. So I can say, well, if I drive employee engagement, then I will drive performance of the organisation. But there's no evidence to support that. You need a certain type of research method called longitudinal design, which means that you are measuring the organisation over time in terms of what the engagement levels and the performance levels are. And there are very few of those studies out there in terms of engagement and performance. So most of the research is just association. So the two variables seem to move together, performance and engagement seem to move together, but we don't actually know whether one is causing the other, or even the direction of causality. So it could be that my organisation's high performing, or I'm high performing, so I feel engaged, rather than feeling engagement driving performance. And in fact, it's probably likely to be iterative. It's probably likely to be a circular process. So trying to pull apart those causal relationships is tricky. So that's the first question, or first question mark, sorry. The second one is, happy work equals engaged employees. So if we're trying to engage employees and we're changing and learning, there's likely to be some discomfort with that. And I think there's also a movement towards what's called this sort of prosaic leadership, that leaders have to be optimistic and happy and constantly energized. And actually, sort of research suggests maybe that masks other underlying issues. And again, the research tells us that job satisfaction and positive feelings, again, are not necessarily correlated. We don't know what the direction of that causality is either. And then we come on to the fact that those two things might actually be driven by the same thing. So if I have lots of friends at work, then I'm probably going to be satisfied with my job, and I'm probably going to be feeling positive about my work as well. So how do you split out positive feelings and job satisfaction and performance? So yeah, there's a bit of a muddle and lots of disentangling to do. Also, Gallup talk about disengaged and engaged employees, and we'll come on to that language in a second. But those two things aren't necessarily two ends of the same scale, because the drivers of disengagement are different from the drivers of engagement. So disengagement could be because of burnout or lack of resources or lack of control over my job, but they aren't necessarily also the drivers. If I stop being burnt out or overworked, doesn't mean to say that I'm necessarily going to become engaged. It might mean that I might actually stay disengaged, because I have a memory of how the organisation treated me and didn't care about my well-being and allowed me to burn out. So the two drivers are different. And disengagement and engagement, yeah, as I mentioned, have different drivers as well. So another example is job security. So I might become disengaged if I feel that my job is not secure, but just because I have a secure job doesn't mean to say that I'm going to become engaged. And the same goes for reward and recognition. If I don't get reward and recognition, I might become disengaged, but if I do get reward and recognition and I expect it, doesn't mean to say that I'm going to become engaged. And then, as I mentioned, there's that whole language. Gallup used this language that disengaged employees are undermining engaged employees. Well, disengaged employees are likely potentially to be suffering from burnout, and they need extra help. So it's not very sympathetic language to talk about them as undermining engaged employees. And in fact, they claim that engaged employees drive high performance, whereas in fact, if I'm burnt out and disengaged, it's probably, or if I'm disengaged, it's probably because I'm burnt out, and I'm burnt out because I've been really trying to drive performance. So the whole language isn't very nice. It's counterproductive framing, I think, to try and get people motivated. And so, yeah, I don't see this as a very helpful way to frame employee engagement. If you use Workday, so what does Workday say about engagement? It's a little bit better. One of the problems with Gallup is that they don't use that foundation. Do you remember we talked about the foundation of evidence, that Gallup isn't built on a solid evidence that we know in organisational development, such as we've got self-determination theory, which is a really important theory around motivation. That's not mentioned by Gallup. Psychological safety isn't mentioned by Gallup. Goal setting isn't mentioned by Gallup. Managerial support is, workload is. But Workday have actually tried to attempt to pull together some of these more robust constructs that we know help motivate and engage employees. But saying that, they still do use ENPS as a composite measure, which we've discussed probably doesn't have anything to do with employee engagement. And they use other constructs which aren't very well defined, like the progress principle, learning culture. Learning culture suffers from similar problems of employee engagement, not really sure what it means, and meaningful work as well. So work they're kind of getting there, but it still doesn't offer us a good robust approach. And so this is a quote from this report from CIPD, where they said, you know, in less technical terms, we can say that all these measures, they kind of are of interest. So all these questions that we ask are of interest. But when we bundle them all together and come up with a single measure, we just end up with meaningless data. It's just a potpourri, a mosh pit of metrics, because there's no underlying constructs. We don't really know when we put all these questions together, what it all means. And so it becomes difficult to interpret it, and it becomes difficult to operationalize it. So an example could be, in your questionnaire, you ask, I feel proud to work for my company. That could be an engagement question. But how do we know that pride, I feel proud, drives performance? You know, what's the evidence to suggest that pride drives performance? Another one could be, I believe that my company is a good employer. But what do we mean by good employer? Different people might have different interpretations of what good employer are. So these high-level composite measures like ENPS, I would recommend a friend, become a bit meaningless because we don't know how to operationalize them. We don't know what it means in practice to be able to get people to feel, you know, that we are a good employer, or that we that we create pride in people. And this is this quote as well from Lawyer, which summarises that that different attitudes that people have towards their organisation will have different effects on performance, and we need to be able to segregate all of that. So it's kind of more complex than a simple question. And if we start to question Gallup and we start to question what that Q12 means, or what the whole idea of engagement means, then all of this data that Gallup published then becomes kind of a bit meaningless. We don't really know, what does it mean to move from 20%, 26% of something to 36% of something. All you can say really is that generally it seems like places are becoming nicer places to work, which kind of makes sense because we improve health and safety, don't we? We become more aware of well-being, we make cultures more inclusive. So yeah, generally places, work is becoming, better, as it were. But that's pretty much all you can conclude from that. So is there any questions on that? We have got quite a bit more to get through, but I did promise a breather. Does this all make sense? Anything that I've said that seems overly complicated or?
Hi, so it's just going back to, I can't remember which slide it was it Workday, but where you mentioned learning culture and the issues with learning culture. Is that because companies just don't, they say we want to be a learning culture and don't fully understand what that means to them?
Yeah, and in academia as well, there's been a lot written about learning culture, but nobody's really nailed down what it means. I think there was a paper recently, Rob Beener published it on LinkedIn, and yeah, it was just questioning what it means and whether it's just a duplicate of other constructs. But yeah, worth reading around that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
I can send you something on that as well if you remind me. Send me an email and remind me to send you something on that, because I've been looking into that because that's part of what I'm trying to do as well. Okay, so let's have a little go back in time and try and understand where all this has come from, where engagement has come from. And it's very interesting during the 1940s and 1950s that in organisational development there was very much a move to be trying scientific and rigorous about where OD was going and the concepts that we have in OD. And at that time there was a lot of really fundamental ideas or constructs that were being solidified around what's called self-efficacy, which is kind of people's confidence that they can do, which is so important for motivation. It's very important for change, and there was also this idea as well that people are interacting with a complex environment, so they need to have a sense of belonging, but also they need to have a sense of autonomy and control over their environment. So we get this idea of functional autonomy, we get this idea of belonging from Maslow as well. But both, Kurt Lewin, right at the origins of organisational development and change, saw organisations as a sort of a feedback process of causal relationships, a sort of a social system. So and then we start to clarify, that starts to be clarified a bit more around what we mean in terms of systems and complex systems. So you got Forrester publishing his Industrial Dynamics, where he's trying to sort of codify how organizations work using a sort of an engineering approach. And Burns and Stalker very early on talking about organizations being adaptive and being open, so that they can draw in energy from outside them because they are living systems. They're not static. Emery and Tris talk about open systems. They talk about environmental textures in which organizations operate, and this is very much the language of complexity. And we start to see a firming up of ideas as well. So Bandura talks about really nails down what is meant by self-efficacy. We start to get other constructs emerging, social exchange theory, which we'll talk about as well. And then we get this sort of 80s and 90s, I guess, is a sort of a golden era of OD, where we get these really strong constructs coming out, like Ryan and Decky's self-determination theory, which pulls together autonomy and self-efficacy and sense of belonging into a theory around motivation. We also get a more sort of behavioural theories around goal setting theory and which is Locke and Latham. And during this time as well, we get Kahn, William Kahn, talking about psychological safety and employee engagement, and we get Weck's work on sense making as well. And then during the 2000 and the noughties, we get a sort of solidifying of these ideas through a process called what's called meta-analysis, where you pull together lots of studies, so you get tens of thousands of observations all in one study, and you can start to draw fairly firm conclusions about what the drivers are of constructs and what they are like, what's likely to happen. So psychological safety, for instance, what are the drivers of psychological safety, and if we try and introduce psychological safety, what impact is that likely to have on the organisation? So we just get a much clearer idea of what the constructs are and what effect they're going to have in an organisation. So we've got things like self-efficacy, organisational justice, trust in leadership. These big studies getting more and more clarity on exactly how important these constructs are, and then we also get a bit of skepticism coming in around certain ideas, and lots of criticism of popular change management processes. And Dennis Turish is also did a critique as well in 2019 of all these different types of leadership styles there are out there, and he picks on authentic leadership and questions that as a robust construct. And then you've got Rob Breiner talking about employee engagement and whether that's a valid construct, which is also sort of referenced in the CIPD as well. So we have all of this work, we have all of these solid constructs out there. So why aren't Gallup and all these popular employee engagement sort of sellers of surveys referring to this stuff and using this stuff in their surveys? And what I find really interesting about this is when we talk about this idea of complex systems, and we talk about the origins of organizational change, these people are very much talking about action and energy and motivation. So Kurt Lewin talks about tensions. Jay Forrester talks about internal flow, because he's an engineer and he was working on supply chains, and he's talking about the flow of energy within organizations. And then we get this idea of control theory within complex systems as well, that we can drive it's complex systems from one state to another state, which is very much a conceptualization of change and engagement, isn't it? Moving people from a disengaged state to a more engaged state, which is all about how we manage energy. And William Kahn actually uses that who is the sort of the father, as it were, the founding sort of thought leader on this, where he talks about people only invest their time in an organization if they feel they're going to get a return on that investment. And this is, as I mentioned, the social exchange kind of idea, that I'll give the organisation my time if the organisation gives me something in return, that my time is not being wasted. And that time, is physical energy, cognitive energy, and emotional energy. And then he sort of says here, it's about people bringing their personal selves. So he talks about meaningful work and purposeful work, that I've got to see some point in what I'm doing, some return on what I'm doing. And the foundation for all of this is Oldman and Hackman's work on concepts around how people invest their time in their work. So there's quite a clear idea here of what engagement is at a very simple level. It's about task engagement. It's about work engagement. It's not necessarily the same as employee engagement. And I'll just come on to, I've just finished writing this series about complex systems. And we know if organizations are complex systems, then there are certain sort of preconditions. And one of those preconditions is having energy, or I call it, it's called numerosity here, but a stock of energy that can drive a complex system in a certain direction. And that energy comes about through diversity, because you're having different conversations, people are having different conversations, they have different viewpoints, and that creates new information, it creates feedback loops that sort of push the organization into a state of self-organization. So people start to collaborate and they start to form teams. And then we get these sort of hierarchical organizations. If you think about an organization moving through a sort of a maturity, as it were, it then becomes robust because everybody's working together. We get these strong connections. So you get an external force coming in and we're able to respond to it, you know, whether it's losing market share or whatever it is. Because of the feedback loops, that system has history and memory, because people tell each other stories about what happened in the past. And it's able to adapt. It's able to maneuver, because I know somebody who can help me with something else, and I can adapt my situation and the organisation's situation to external demands. So but the fundamental thing behind all of this is about energy and exchange of energy and feedback, that holds everything together. So you can see why engagement, I think, people think of it as such a crucial idea, but it's actually quite sort of nebulous. So that's my thoughts on the history and background to this. Any questions on that? On the history, complexity, why engagement conceptualized as energy might be. So let me move on. You can put questions into the chat if you want, and I will pick them up when we have another breather. So what does the evidence tell us then? So we've got the sort of the consultants selling these questionnaires and selling, you know, their theories of engagement. We've got some idea of what the history of engagement is. 40 years on from that initial sort of, well, 30 years on from that initial conceptualization, where is most of the research being done? And most of the research is being done around this idea of engagement being a balance between demands and resources, which is called the JDR model, job demands and resources model. And demands obviously reduce your energy levels, and resources bring your energy levels up. I mean, you can see here this meta-analysis done by Catherine Bailey and co. Found that there were 65 studies that relate to that sort of conceptualization of engagement. And we also mentioned the social exchange theory, so that's the sort of second most cited one, that employees will exert effort if they feel that they are treated well, which again is a conceptualization of energy, isn't it, in a way, and demands and resources, that I'll only give something if I think I'm going to get something in return, but it's slightly different. There's a theory around conservation resources theory, which is around this conceptualization of energy. And then there is this idea of positive emotions broad and build theory by Barbara Fredrickson, which Gallup also use in their assessment as well. So they're the sort of different conceptualizations, and they fit with this idea, you know, that I mentioned before about this broad definition of employee engagement. And the most popular measure here of these are, well, I'll go into that on the next slide. So the most popular definition that's used is this definition here, that engagement consists of vigor, so how much energy I'm putting into my work, and refers to sort of resilience whilst I'm working, whether I can sort of bounce back when I face setbacks. So how much energy am I putting in? How much dedication? The levels of enthusiasm and inspiration and pride that I have in my work, and how absorbed I am in that work as well. And this is measured through what's called the Utrecht Work Engagement Scale. If you can see that at the bottom there under engagement. So you can actually just use these 3 questions to measure that, which is at work, at my work, I feel bursting with energy. I'm enthusiastic about my job, and I'm immersed in my work, which measure vigor, dedication, and absorption, respectively. So the bottom one is absorption, I'm immersed in my work. The top one is vigor, at work I feel bursting with energy. So there's 3 very simple conceptualization of engagement, but that's not necessarily the same as that sort of work engagement, task level engagement. It's not necessarily the same as organizational engagement, which then we start to get in. It starts to get complicated because there are lots of different factors that affect this. So this is very much just task. Am I engaged in my day-to-day work? And you can see here what I find interesting is that these questions here on engagement are very similar to, or the opposite of, burnout. So if I'm not engaged in my tasks, then maybe I'm burnt out. I feel tired. I'm at the end of my patience. I'm afraid that my work is making me uncaring. And you can see how closely they relate to engagement. And well-being as well. This is the WHO 3 questions from WHO 5. So this is the World Health Organization, 5 questions around well-being, which is obviously very well validated. And again, I feel active and vigorous. They actually use the word vigorous, and we're saying that this first one is a measure of vigor. I feel cheerful and in good spirits. So the question then is, well, if all we want to do, like the Gallup 12, if all we want to do is just measure involvement in a task of an employee, then there's 3 simple questions that we can ask here, and we can check on people, and we actually know that they're measures of well-being as well. And we also know it's going to give us some idea of resilience. Remember, William Kahn talked about in this definition back here, we talked about resilience in terms of vigor as well. So it will give you some indication of how resilient people are, and that's so important for organizational change, or just work generally, or COVID-19, or going through digital transformation. When people are learning, can they bounce back? So at a very simple level, we can get some idea of how much effort people are willing to put into their work, and really this is just a measure of readiness to do work, and doing work is a definition of energy. So that's a very simple idea that I think any organization, if you're not doing anything else, just measure, well-being, burnout, or engagement, or a combination of those, just to find out how much energy people have to give. But if we are wanting to come up with a broader definition, then we really have to break engagement down. And what CIPD do in their report is break it down into work motivation. So there's a clear construct around that. We mentioned that, sort of Ryan and Decky and the goal setting theory. And then there's feedback that ties into that as well, because we know that we become better at hitting our goals if we're getting feedback on our performance. So there's work motivation. There's this concept. Another fairly solid construct is organizational commitment, and we can break that down into meaningful work, into the kind of rewards that we're getting. We can break that down further into ideas around psychological safety, which we know is a rigorous concept as well. Empowerment is kind of less rigorous, and we know that's related to a sense of autonomy and having clear work as well. And sense of autonomy relates to work motivation. So there's sort of overlap there, which is why I've done this as these overlapping circles. Being clear on my role. So remember, Gallup had that at the bottom of their needs. I'm clear on what I'm meant to be doing. Social support as well is so critical. And also they break it down into organizational identification, which some people argue is actually very similar to effective commitment, i.e. emotional commitment, is kind of the same as organisational identification. But anyway, CIPD split that out. So we can conceive of engagement, employee engagement, as being those three things kind of added together. And what's kind of attractive about this model as well is that at the bottom here, you've got what you might call a sense of belonging. So I belong, I commit to an organisation, sense of belonging, sense of organisational identification. So this is me in the broader world of the organisation. And we also have this idea of sort of uniqueness or autonomy at the top, which is how motivated I am at an individual level, my behaviour and how I think and feel about my work, which is related more to that very simple concept of energy and task engagement with task. So it sort of broadens out that simple concept into one that's sort of related to or how that works within this complex system of the organisation that we're working. And that also allows us to then break down how do we view an inclusive culture. So if an inclusive culture is one that can integrate both my feeling of uniqueness, which is this individual motivation, sense of autonomy, and this sense of belonging to something bigger than myself. So being, cohesive with my colleagues and collaborating with my colleagues. So it allows us to view an organisation on that perspective as well. So I think this conceptualisation is quite useful. And also we know, sorry, you can't see this very well, but you see this in my post on LinkedIn. We also know that change, if we're going to get an organisation to change, we also need to be thinking about goal setting and feedback processes and thinking about having a clear vision as well, and creating sense of autonomy and fair change processes as well. So fairness comes in here, and trusting relationships. So there's also a lot of overlap. If we're going to measure employee engagement, it's also giving us an idea of how receptive the organisation and individuals are going to be to change as well. So if you're running an engagement survey, you can also use it as a change readiness assessment. So I'm just aware of time. We've got 10 minutes. So this is, I know this looks complicated, but it is complicated. When you pull all of this together, this is what I've conceived we end up with. We end up with lots of robust constructs around psychological safety, organisational fairness, goal setting, feedback. They all plug into change capability, which I mentioned. Commitment, identification, and motivation, we said, tie into employee engagement. And then we've also got this idea within CIPD of good work as well, which measures employee voice, the quality of the contract that I have with my employee, work-life balance, well-being, relationship. So all of this can be summarised into these 16 valid constructs that are drawn from research that we can go out and go to an organisation and say, right, let's test where you are against all these 16 different areas. And this is conceived as 4 areas: how I feel, that's subjective, how I feel, what my behaviours are, that me, which is the sort of what other people see, the interobjective, which is the systems around me, the organisational structure, the leadership, the strategy, so things that we see, that we interact with when we're employees in organisations. And then what we might call the intersubjective, which is how I interact with others in the organisation as well. So within the organisation, how do we all work together? That's about culture, relationships, language, and stories. And so you can then fit all of these 16 measures into those 4 different quadrants, which gives you the 4 different perspectives of employee capability, organisational capability, or employee engagement. And I'll just skip through so I thought of taking out all of the, I'll skip through this. So then that, once you run this survey, then that allows you to say, okay, so we've got a low score on leadership. We know leadership is affecting employee engagement or change capability or levels of well-being. So we've got a low score on that area. And we know it's a high priority because the way that we run our surveys in organisations is that we ask employees which of these 16 is most important for them. And we know it's going to have a high impact because we're scoring low. And what this tells us is that there are these intercorrelations between leadership and purpose, for example, here. So we can see there's a strong, wide line there between leadership and purpose. So we know if we have a clear purpose, that's going to create more trust in leadership. We know that support is also correlated with leadership. So then we can start to break down and understand what the interrelationships are. And what I do for organisations is map their current questions. So I know organisations go away and make up their own engagement surveys with their own questions. And then we can sort of map those questions broadly to these constructs, and we can say, right, we've got some gaps in certain areas. And this is one that I did recently for an organisation where I'm saying, look, you've got a blind spot around well-being because you're not asking people around how confident they feel or what their sense of autonomy is. So that's a gap you might want to fill with additional questions. And the beauty of this is that if you are measuring an organisation against valid constructs, then you can then start to deep dive into those constructs. You can then say, okay, if we want to build trusting relationships, we know what the drivers of trusting relationships are, which all these things, organisational support, whether people are to participate in decision making, whether there have been contract breaches, for example, you've been through a redundancy and people don't feel they've been treated fairly. They're all drivers of trust in leadership. And we know we'll get these outcomes if we invest in trusted leadership. So when we start to do interventions, we can start to see what the return on investment of that intervention is going to be, because it's all traceable through these valid, robust constructs. And what I would suggest when you're running your surveys is that you start off with a few of these areas that you want to improve, whether it's fairness in decision making or psychological safety or trust in leadership or individual autonomy, whatever it is you feel that you need to focus on in order to deliver your business needs. There may be 2 or 3 of those, and then you can pulse against those, just run a short survey just to see whether the interventions that you're running are actually driving those scores and whether you're seeing improvements in those areas. And that helps people through the change process, because then they can start to see how that survey relates to their day-to-day work. And they can see the change on the ground because you're running these interventions, and then you're having discussions around whether those interventions worked or not. And then you baseline at the end of the year, and then maybe your strategic priorities change and you want to try out some new or develop some new competencies. What I would avoid is any solutioneering. So any sort of, right, let's implement authentic leadership. Let's just do more communication. Let's have growth orientated conversations. Let's focus on well-being. And this is what we get from Gallup with their recommendations for 2022. We don't know why necessarily you would focus on these things. Maybe they're not appropriate for your organisation. So by conducting a proper, robust survey, you would know yourself which areas you want to what you want to focus on. So I'd recommend this process: run the survey, consult with stakeholders on the results, socialise the results, and start to think about engagement as something that's temporary, something that you can shift. Detractors are detracting, if there is such a thing, or disengage because they're burnt out and they need help, or because they don't have enough resources and they need help. So start to socialise what those results mean. Prioritise, just have 2 or 3 things that you want to do better, run interventions, pulse whether those interventions are working, and then share those stories of what did or didn't work. So you create this, Sean, you talk about organisational learning. So you're constantly learning about what works and what doesn't work within your context, rather than just taking a solution that, say, Gartner or some consultancy say, this is what you should be doing because it's what everybody else is doing. And this is an evidence-based approach. And if you take that approach and you can show employees, this is the process that we go through. This is a valid, auditable process that we go through in order to try and improve our workplace and allow people to flourish and grow, help people to flourish and grow. Then you'll become more agile because you'll know on what basis you're making decisions, and everybody knows they can make decisions themselves based on that process. You create trust because there's this audit trail. You empower people because they can see how the interventions are working and whether they are having impact or not. It creates congruence with your values. Most people talk about respect and fairness, and this is what it is. And it's about transparent, objective decision making, and it builds confidence as well, that leadership and managers and everybody knows what they're doing in the organisation. So I hope that's helped you understand how you can manipulate your current data. You can start to do correlations between the questions and start to understand what the interrelationships are. You can start to map them to these constructs and then use those constructs like trust in leadership to then read some of the literature around, okay, so how do we improve trust in leadership? So hopefully that's given you some idea of how you can use your data, bit around the history, bit around problems with engagement, and a bit around how we can move forward, and maybe some red flags around what consultants might be selling you. And as I said at the beginning, you don't have to believe what I say. Please go into the research and do your own sort of reading around it. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Sorry we don't have much time. I'm happy to do more of these in the future if you want to dive deeper. So please send me an email asking to, either we can have a one-to-one or we can set up another session. So I hope you found it useful. Please put any comments you have in the chat. So thank you very much, and don't forget to fill out the form as well. Thank you.